Right now, close to half of everyone alive on Earth already lives in a country where fertility has fallen below the level needed to replace its own population. In 1950, the average woman on the planet had 4.7 children in her lifetime. Today, that global average sits at roughly 2.2. According to the most detailed long-range projection ever published on this topic, by the year 2100, 97% of the world's countries, 198 out of 204, will have fertility rates too low to sustain their own population size without immigration. South Korea, the country with the lowest fertility rate ever recorded anywhere on Earth, has spent more than $200 billion over 2 decades trying to reverse the trend. And only, just barely, in the last year, has it started to work. Japan just recorded its 10th consecutive year of declining births, and Japan's own government now estimates that roughly a third of the women born in that country in 2005 may never have a child at all. This is the story of what demographers actually mean when they call this a demographic time bomb. What the real data says is coming by 2100, and where the picture is more complicated and more human than a single scary headline can capture. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data actually shows. Drop a comment and tell me what the birth rate looks like in your own country, because I read every one of these. If you want grounded, data-driven coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach people who need to understand this before the policies built around it start reaching them. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand any of the numbers that follow, you first need to understand one concept demographers return to constantly: the replacement fertility rate. In most developed countries, a population needs an average of about 2.1 children per woman to hold steady over time, accounting for children who do not survive to adulthood and a roughly even split between male and female births. Fall meaningfully below that number for long enough, and a population starts shrinking, math that has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with basic arithmetic. According to the United Nations World Population Prospects, the 2024 revision, the global fertility rate currently stands at 2.25 live births per woman, down from 4.7 just 3 generations ago, a decline the UN itself describes as 1 fewer child on average than a generation ago. The UN's own median projection has that global rate falling to 2.1, the replacement threshold itself, by the late 2040s, and continuing down to around 1.8 by the year 2100. Under that projection, the world's population is expected to keep growing for roughly another 50 to 60 years, peaking somewhere around 10.3 billion people in the mid-2080s, before gradually declining to about 10.2 billion by the century's end. The UN currently estimates an 80% likelihood that global population peaks sometime this century at all, and notably, the 2100 population estimate has already been revised downward by about 700 million people compared to what the UN was projecting just a decade ago, a sign of just how much faster this shift has been arriving than expected. 1 in 4 people alive today already lives in a country where the population has already peaked and started to shrink. A separate and considerably more detailed long-range analysis comes from the Global Burden of Disease study, published in the Lancet and led by researchers at the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. Their most recent update, released in March of last year, used data collected from 1950 through 2021 across 204 countries and territories to model fertility out to the end of the century. And their projection runs even lower than the UN's. According to that study, the global fertility rate, having already fallen from 4.8 children per woman in 1950 to about 2.2 today, is projected to keep declining to roughly 1.8 by 2050 and to 1.6 by 2100. By 2050, the study found 76% of the world's countries, 155 out of 204, will already have fertility rates too low to sustain their population size. By 2100, that climbs to 97%, 198 countries, leaving just 6 countries on the entire planet still having enough children to sustain their own population without relying on immigration. Stein Emil Volset, the study's senior researcher, described the resulting picture as a genuine divide between what he called baby boom and baby bust regions of the world, one that he said will completely reconfigure the global economy and the international balance of power over the coming decades. It is worth pausing on why 2 respected research groups, the UN and the IHME, land on somewhat different numbers, because that gap itself tells you something important about how uncertain long-range demographic forecasting genuinely is. Both groups are working from the same basic underlying data, birth records, census figures, and survey results collected over decades, but they use different statistical models and different assumptions about how quickly fertility will keep falling and where it might eventually level off. Neither projection is a prophecy. Both are informed extrapolations of a trend that has, so far, consistently moved in one direction, downward, for over 70 years running, in country after country, regardless of that country's wealth, religion, or political system. That regional divergence Lancet described becomes much clearer when you break it down by country and continent, because this is not remotely a uniform, evenly distributed global trend. An earlier Lancet study from the same research group, published in 2020, projected that more than 20 countries, including Japan, Spain, Italy, Thailand, Portugal, South Korea, and Poland, would see their total populations cut in half or more by 2100. China, currently the world's second most populous country, was projected to fall from about 1.4 billion people today to somewhere in the range of 730 million by the end of the century, an enormous contraction for a country that has spent decades being defined by its sheer population size. Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa is expected to move in almost the exact opposite direction, with the region's population roughly tripling in size, and researchers now project it will account for somewhere between a third and over half of all live births happening anywhere on the planet by 2100. Nigeria specifically is projected to expand dramatically, potentially reaching close to 800 million people and becoming one of the 2 or 3 most populous countries on Earth, alongside India, which is expected to become the world's most populous nation as China's numbers decline. The consulting firm McKinsey Global Institute has framed this same split bluntly in its own research, describing much of the world as heading toward what it calls population collapse, while noting that the countries facing that collapse, mostly wealthier, more developed economies, are simultaneously the ones with the least capacity to absorb the kind of rapid population growth still happening in lower income regions. South Korea offers the clearest, most extreme case study of where this trend can lead, and it is genuinely worth walking through the numbers year by year, because the trajectory itself tells a story. South Korea's fertility rate fell to 0.78 in 2022, then to 0.72 in 2023, a figure that remains the lowest fertility rate ever officially recorded for any country in human history, meaning the average South Korean woman was expected to have well under 1 child across her entire reproductive lifetime. In Seoul specifically, the country's capital and one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in, the fertility rate that same year sank even lower, to around 0.55. South Korea's government has poured more than 280 trillion won, roughly $210 billion, into programs meant to reverse the trend since 2006. Cash grants for newborns, paid parental leave, expanded childcare and housing assistance among them, and for nearly 2 decades, none of it meaningfully worked. Population Reference Bureau President Jennifer Schuba has argued the crisis is, in her words, primarily a gender issue rather than a purely economic one, pointing to the OECD's own assessment that wide gaps between men and women in both jobs and pay, layered on top of South Korea's brutal education and housing costs, sit at the center of the career versus family trade-off so many South Korean women are weighing. Here is where the story gets genuinely more complicated and more interesting than a simple decline narrative, and it is worth including precisely because leaving it out would make this coverage less accurate rather than more dramatic. In 2025, South Korea's fertility rate actually rose to 0.80, up from 0.75 the year before, marking the country's second annual increase and the largest single-year jump in births since 2007. That rebound has outpaced even the South Korean government's own optimistic case projections. Sociologist Shin Kyung-ah has cautioned that the data still needs closer scrutiny, since shifts in the underlying population composition can distort a single year's reading. But she also noted the rebound is meaningful, as a signal that public attitudes may genuinely be shifting, pointing to a government survey showing 52.5% of South Koreans now expressing positive views of marriage, up from 50.1% just 2 years earlier. None of that undoes South Korea's extraordinary demographic hole. A fertility rate of 0.8 is still barely a third of what is needed to sustain the population, and the country's total population of roughly 51 million remains on a trajectory to be cut in half by the end of the century if current patterns hold. But it is a real, data-confirmed reminder that these trends are not simple, unstoppable prophecies. They can bend, even if only slightly, in response to real shifts in economic conditions and social attitudes. Japan's trajectory over the same period tells the opposite story, and it connects most directly to the specific claim in this video's title because Japan's demographic crisis is not just about couples having fewer children, it is increasingly about a rising share of people never having any children at all. Japan recorded its 10th consecutive year of declining births in 2025, with preliminary data showing just 705,809 children born nationwide. a drop of roughly 2% from the year before. Japan's own fertility rate has ticked up slightly over the past 2 years, from 1.2 to 1.38, but births overall kept falling, because fewer women are entering their childbearing years in the first place after decades of decline, a phenomenon demographers call population momentum, where a shrinking generation of young adults means fewer potential parents, regardless of how many children each of them chooses to have. Most striking of all, Japan's National Institute of Population and Social Security Research estimated in a widely cited 2023 report that 33.4% of women born in 2005, roughly a third, are projected to remain childless throughout their lives, with the range across different scenarios running from 24.6% in the most optimistic case to as high as 42% in the most pessimistic one. Miho Iwasawa, the Institute's director of population dynamics research, pointed to people marrying later in life as the central driver, since in Japan, as in South Korea, childbearing outside of marriage remains genuinely rare, representing only around 2 to 4% of all births compared to more than 60% of births in France, meaning a decline in marriage rates in East Asia translates almost directly into a decline in births rather than being softened by rising childbearing outside marriage the way it has been in parts of Western Europe. That connection between declining marriage and rising permanent childlessness is not unique to Japan either. Research from the Institut National d'études démographiques in France has found that East Asia now has the highest childlessness levels anywhere in the world, and that among women born in the 1960s and 1970s, rising childlessness itself, not simply couples choosing to have one child instead of 2 or 3, accounts for roughly 2/3 of the entire fertility decline observed in Japan, Hong Kong, and South Korea over that period. That is the piece of the story genuinely closest to this video's title. It is not that half the world's population will personally have 0 children by 2100. That specific claim goes further than the data actually supports. What is true and thoroughly documented is that close to half the world's population already lives in a country below the replacement fertility threshold today. That share is on track to become the overwhelming majority of humanity by century's end, and in the specific countries driving this trend hardest, rising individual childlessness, not merely smaller families, is now doing much of the work. It is also worth understanding why this is happening at nearly every income level and in nearly every kind of society simultaneously, because it is not confined to wealthy East Asian democracies. Researchers at the American Enterprise Institute have pointed out that fertility is falling in rich and poor countries alike, in booming and stagnating economies alike, and in secular and deeply religious societies alike. Colombia's fertility rate now sits at 1.06. Iran's sits at 1.44. Turkey's sits at 1.48, all below the United States' own rate. And researchers note the broader decline accelerated sharply beginning around 2014, years before the COVID-19 pandemic gave the trend an additional temporary push downward in many countries. The underlying drivers researchers point to again and again are strikingly consistent across very different cultures. Rapid urbanization, pulling young people away from extended family networks that once helped with child rearing, rising education levels, and the delayed marriage that tends to follow them. Women's growing participation in paid work and the career costs that motherhood can still impose on that work, and the sharply rising cost of raising a child, from housing to education to childcare, in a world where children no longer function as an economic asset to a family the way they once did in agricultural societies. The consequences of this shift, if current trends hold anywhere close to their projected path, are what demographers actually mean when they invoke the phrase demographic time bomb. And it is a specific mechanical concern rather than a vague one. As fertility falls and life expectancy simultaneously rises, the ratio between working-age adults and retirees shifts sharply, meaning a shrinking pool of workers is left supporting a growing population of retirees through pension systems, healthcare spending, and social services largely built during an era of continuous population growth. The 2020 Lancet study projected that the number of children under 5 worldwide would fall by more than 40%, from 681 million in 2017 to around 401 million by 2100, even as the number of people over the age of 80 was projected to climb toward 866 million by the same date. That is the mechanical core of the demographic time bomb, not simply fewer people, but a fundamentally inverted age structure, with far more elderly dependents supported by far. Fewer working-age taxpayers than any modern pension or healthcare system was originally designed to handle. So what does all of this actually mean for you? Wherever in the world you happen to be reading this from, it means understanding that if you live in a country with a fertility rate already well below 2.1, and that now describes most of East Asia, most of Europe, and a growing share of the Americas, The conversations happening today around pension reform, immigration policy, and retirement age are not abstract political debates. They are direct, mechanical responses to a demographic shift that is already locked in for at least the next few decades, regardless of what policy changes happen from here. It means recognizing that South Korea's genuine, if modest, 2020 rebound is worth watching closely, because if a rise like that can happen even briefly in the country with the lowest fertility rate ever recorded, it suggests these trends are shaped by real, addressable conditions, marriage attitudes, job market gender gaps, housing costs, rather than being a fixed, unchangeable feature of modern life. And it means being skeptical of the most extreme, single-line summaries of this topic, since the actual data shows a story that is regionally uneven, occasionally reversible, and considerably more complicated than any single number, including the very one in this video's own title, can fully capture on its own. The honest, grounded summary is this. Global fertility has fallen from 4.7 children per woman in 1950 to roughly 2.2 today, and virtually every serious long-range projection, from the United Nations to the Global Burden of Disease study published in the Lancet, expects that decline to continue for the rest of the century, with the most detailed of those studies projecting that 97% of the world's countries will fall below the replacement fertility threshold by 2100. That decline is playing out unevenly, with countries across East Asia and much of Europe facing the sharpest contractions, some projected to see their populations cut in half or more, while sub-Saharan Africa is expected to roughly triple in population over the same period, producing the sharp baby boom, baby bust divide researchers increasingly describe. In the countries driving this trend hardest, Japan and South Korea in particular, rising permanent childlessness, not simply smaller families, is doing an increasing share of the work, with Japan's own government projecting that roughly a third of women born in 2005 may never have children at all. And even inside that broader trend, South Korea's genuine 2025 rebound is a real, data-confirmed reminder that these numbers are shaped by policy and social conditions that can shift, not a fixed prophecy locked in for the next 75 years. We are going to keep tracking this as new population data is released, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the United Nations, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, and national statistics agencies actually collecting this data, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because based on how fast these numbers have already been revised over just the past decade, this picture is very likely to keep shifting. And leave that comment below. Tell me what the fertility rate and birth trends actually look like in your own country right now. Because behind every one of these numbers is a young couple in Seoul, weighing a career against a family in one of the most expensive cities on earth. A 33% chance that a woman born in Japan 20 years ago will spend her entire life without a child of her own, and a demographer somewhere right now quietly, revising a decade-old projection downward for the second time this year, trying to keep up with a trend that keeps moving faster than anyone expected it to. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.